I will actually be giving away the R36S that's in this video. Make sure you stick around to the end and I'll tell you exactly how. Budget retro handhelds are quickly becoming my favourite niche within an already niche market, and undoubtedly you'll be familiar with this top device. It's the R36S, which we did a video of in one of our previous 4 videos on the channel, but it now has a little copycat all of its own in the lovely XU10, which comes from Handheld. Now certainly when you put these side by side, there are definite similarities. The position of the analog sticks being different between them, and this small notch on the rear of the XU10, as well as a couple of other ergonomic feature changes. There's also a speaker on the front and the back, and it uses a teardrop style D-pad, which some people like and others don't. However, I will say this is actually quite a good example of it. Up close, the differences are obvious, and there are actually a couple of tweaks on the internals which will potentially make a big difference to your playing experience, which we will go into. Now on the bottom of the R36S, you've got the 3.5mm jack, the OTG port, as well as your charging input. The 3.5mm port is on the side of the XU10, and they also have a dedicated menu button over here, right by the LED light. The power button's actually on the rear, which is an interesting change, and it's flanked by a reset button. The best change here though are the ergonomic triggers. Not only do the haptics sound much more quiet, aka they're not cheap and clicky, the middle 2 buttons are slightly raised, and it means your finger sits much more comfortably. Aside from that, we've got our 2 SD card slots on each side, one for the operating system and one for your dedicated games. However, you can have them all on a single card. I wouldn't recommend keeping the default card they come with because, as we all know, they are absolute trash. Now onto the internals, they're both actually running the same chipset. The R36S is running the A35, but it's clocked at 1.5 GHz. It's a 64-bit chip, and we've seen it used across the board, and it can run a number of emulators. What's interesting here is the XU10 actually runs the same chip, but slightly faster at 1.6 GHz. The 10 features 1 GB of DDR4, which is clocked at 2666 MHz, has a 3.5-inch display that's IPS 640 by 480, and a Mali G31 GPU. Now, whereas the R36S now ships with Garlic OS 2.0, which is a reasonable OS and allows for some customization, the XU10 ships with its own Linux-based system that has a few drawbacks. While many of its emulators do seem to run on the RetroArch systems, there's not a huge amount of customization. When you go into a game, some of them will have a menu allowing you to save state, while many of them won't, and yes, that does relate to the core you're using. Tweaking those isn't as straightforward as it is on Garlic OS. As far as the 2 panels go, they're both IPS 640 by 480, and as you can see on the right hand side, we have a significantly dimmer display. Now, once we had everything set up correctly, the display brightness came up quite a lot, but actually on the left it was only at 50% from the start. Color reproduction between the 2 displays is also slightly different, with the R36S being much warmer, in contrast to the cooler but maybe more accurate display of the XU10. Another key point of note here is that when we're trying out the N64 emulation, the R36S seems to have some serious issues here. Not only do we have glitching in the distance, my poor old ant got chopped clean in half, and no matter which core I chose, we still had the same issues cropping up. I've experienced this on this device many times, and that's where potentially the simplicity of the operating system over on the 10 might actually be a benefit. N64 emulation seems to be much better over here. Now, whether or not that 100 MHz difference in the clock speed is making a huge change, I really don't see that. We also don't have the graphical glitches, and yes, while I may be able to tweak my R36S to get the same level of performance out of it, if you're after a device straight out the box that's working, well, I'm really impressed with the 10. But I do think it is fair to say that for most people, the more saturated, brighter display of the R36S is going to be preferable, particularly in some emulators. The 10 just looks a little dull in comparison. Build quality is really important to me. When I have to hold a device in my hands and try and finally finish Chrono Trigger after like 50 hours, I want it to be comfortable, and I think that's where the 10 really excels. The actual device itself is painted with a textured, high-quality matte paint. It has that tactile feel as opposed to the plastic on the R36S. Secondly, you've got dual speakers over here, and they are very loud. Then there's the shaping of the device itself. I don't really approve of the notch on the top, it's completely pointless, but the raised triggers on the back, the more rounded edges, and the slightly higher quality finish, they feel more premium. I also was surprised by how well the D-pad works. In testing, you can actually move right and left using just the bottom button. It means when you're playing fighting games, it's much easier to roll those special ability moves if you're good enough, and it's not nearly as stiff as the one on the R36. I'm not quite as convinced about having the power and reset buttons on the rear though, those are a bit of a pain to reach, but using the hex screws is also another nice high quality touch as opposed to the Phillips screws on the R36. It's potentially a shame for most that it doesn't have the quick release battery, but it's easy enough to open up if you've got the right tools and change that out if needed. On that note, the battery is 3000 milliamp hours on the XU10 and it's supposedly 3.5 on R36, well at least some models, because others I've seen 2.8. I guess it depends which one you're lucky enough to get your hands on. Still, I haven't actually noticed any differences in terms of battery life. They seem to be very consistent across the board, although I will note I have had a couple of issues charging my R36S if you don't use a low enough powered charger. In fact, you can run into some serious issues because it doesn't have a controller chip for incoming power, so make sure you don't use anything that's too powerful. You can actually brick your device. N64 Mario 64 runs well on both devices. However, again, I do see a slight improvement in performance on the XU10. Another issue becomes apparent on the screen though, in that the off-axis angle is where the 10 really suffers. You lose a lot of clarity as you move past the direct on view and head to any off-angle view, where the R36 doesn't suffer for that and has very good viewing angles. This operating system also doesn't exactly look very aesthetically pleasing. It's quite childish with its stark, bold blue colors. You can't change these themes. In fact, you can only switch between this, which is supposedly the advanced mode, and a kid mode. We won't even go there. But emulation's excellent. When we move over to PlayStation, it's almost flawless. One of the main things I always notice when there are issues are these sound stutters, but we don't have any of that here with Crash Bandicoot. And as I say, when you're looking directly onto the screen, it actually looks fine, if not exceptional. DS also works really well, and that's probably a good time to talk about one of the probably most contentious aspects of both of these devices in comparison to each other, and that's the position of these joysticks. Now, initially when I first saw them, I straight away thought that this 10 would be a worse setup, having the joysticks closer to the middle. But actually, from a physiological standpoint, my thumbs are very long, and having to bunch them up to reach the sides of the R36S is a lot more difficult than having them closer to the center. It really will depend on your hand shape, but with the improved ergonomics of the buttons on the back, I actually do prefer these nearer to the middle. Obviously, most of the games we play use the D-pad, so that's the main factor here. Both devices do use these slightly more expensive joysticks that have the L3 and R3 buttons. Some don't have that, and that's very useful for things like the DS emulation. That's what's used for your touch input. Dreamcast is another system that seems to benefit from the slightly higher clock speeds on the 10, and Crazy Taxi just looks and runs almost perfectly. There are a few hitches and stutters, but overall it's very good. As is God of War, in fact impressively so. It really does run well. Onto one of my favourite classics of all time and its driver. My goodness, does this game hold up well. The physics of the cars are still impressive to this day. You compare that to some of the modern releases, even Cyberpunk when it first came out, man, those vehicles were terrible. This is another one that runs flawlessly. On the subject of out-the-box performance, the XU10 launches with a number of different systems. I think there's over 30, don't quote me on that, but I think there are around 30 different emulators. And you get some really nice arcade games that are actually a little more difficult to run. Metal Slug here is running brilliantly, and it looks great. These are the perfect types of games for this type of system. With the tokenary run of Aladdin, that's where you really get a good idea of the sound and how loud it can get to on here. So you've got a decision to make really. The XU10 offers slightly improved performance, a slightly worse screen but better build quality, and around about the same battery life, with an operating system that's very good for pick up and play but not as good for customization. The R36S offers, well, the other things. The build quality is not as good, the screen's better, the battery life supposedly should be slightly longer, but the performance is slightly worse because the chip is clocked a little lower. For me, I'm all about build quality, performance, and usually screen, but here I don't think it's so bad that it warrants me needing the R36. In fact, for me, the ergonomics of the XU10, the ease of use, and the performance mean that I can play my PSP games at a higher frame rate than I could on the R36S. The N64 is better, the sound quality is better, and one slightly unusual aspect is that it doesn't have any electrical sound. With my R36, I noticed when charging or at other times, you can actually get some electrical interference come through the speakers. I haven't experienced that on my 10 now. That may be an issue that only I had, but it smacks of a slightly lower build quality overall. So yeah, for me at the moment at least, unless something changes, the XU10 is going to be my mid-range daily driver. Let me know in the comments if there are any things that I've missed, any questions that you have, and I'll make sure to answer them. This is the 5th video on the channel. I hope you enjoy it. As I said at the start, I will be giving away the R36S. All you have to do is leave a comment down below, click all the buttons so the algorithm says, yeah, that's all right, and let me know what your favorite game to emulate is. Doesn't necessarily have to be the most powerful one, but what's that game that you just love to replay? For me, it's definitely Chrono Trigger. And the irony of that is I've only ever played it on these emulation devices. I never played it back in the day. All that's left to say then is do have a good week and don't forget to hit continue.